since the reasons behind why we remember something the way that we do is often part of the history of the thing itself. It's often a pretty crucial part that gets left out, sometimes deliberately. So tonight's going to be a mix of history, historiography, and anecdotes of my own. The bulk of what we're looking at tonight is jazz as it existed in the 1960s. Specifically the music that's usually omitted from those discussions, why it's omitted, and how that's important to us today.
Everybody's going to bed and sleep and we're up all night. Instead, games and movies are our sweet reveries. We present 3 a.m. Solid.
So now that we've discussed the build-up to the scene in terms of both musicians and attitudes, let's talk about the scene itself. Beginning, of course, with Ornette Coleman. In 1959, Ornette Coleman put out The Shape of Jazz to Come, and as the title would suggest, he did make good on the promise of Tristano's free improvisations. Even though he was building on the ideas of the players before him, he was the first of the truly free musicians. Now, unlike some of the free playing that had come before, his goal was to completely disavow the European borrowings that had previously marked forays into the free realm, and to take the music down a more Afrocentric route, which here was about a purposeful eschewing of things like form, structure, harmony, all that stuff. Ideologically, for a lot of players, this was inadvertently actually just an extension of Duke's own thoughts on the idiom. Just the same way these new guys were experimenting with single-note melodies, or shrieks, squawks, unconventional sounds like that, many players intended to harken back to the primal, purely expressive sounds of field hollers and ring shouts, and indeed, back to the proverbial motherland itself. Coleman's work proposed an entirely new way of conceiving the music, one that was based less in interpretation and more in invention. Harmonics, time signatures, phrase structures, chord changes, even the conventional timbral quality of an instrument, get them all out of here, we're done with them. And because we're foregoing harmony, we're also foregoing harmonic instruments. So instruments like piano, guitar, vibraphone, a lot of these new trios and quartets did not have them. Which I guess is ironic, a pianist sitting here talking about this stuff, but hey, whatever. Now of course there are going to be people who are going to hear this stuff and call it meaningless, or noise, but, and this is the heady shit I really like to think about, just like the European musicians, who had about 60 years prior experienced a similar upheaval in thought, this prompted the question of what fundamentally separated music from being noise. Now on the subjective level, if something hits our ears and we think it sounds good, it's music, right? Or at least it has a musical quality. But on the subjective level, literally all the music that gets made today was considered out of the question at some point. In any music you could talk about, human nature has always been to embellish and explore the possibilities. In fact, such embellishments actually formed the crux of Western musical development. First we had the plain chants, then from there we had organum and motets. Then from there we get the major and minor third, which expanded harmonic possibilities. And then later than that, we get functional harmony, which leads to everything we have today. And all of that stuff at some point was considered sinful and evil in the eyes of God. If you look at the history, early critics said the exact same thing about the hottest jazz as they would later say about swing, about bebop, about the avant-garde, about rock, about hip-hop. It doesn't change. Humans just don't like new shit. Humans make new shit. Other humans don't like new shit. That's how it works. So looked at from this perspective, what's going on here isn't any different. And for these new musicians, the magic of what they were doing was largely in the sincerity and the preparation. And that must seem really weird from the outside in. Not just because of how it sounded, but because of what the reality was if you chose to make this music. As you might expect, you are not making money playing this stuff, and it's the same way now. And this attitude led a lot of the new musicians to dislike not just pop musicians, but jazz musicians too, especially those who were progressively crossing into funk and rock, which is what we're going to talk about later. Not only was it hard for even the most famous of the new musicians to find work, like for example, Cecil Taylor famously had to take on a second menial job just to pay his bills, but the work they could find steadily decreased. Los Angeles, Chicago, St. Louis, just to name a few, cities were increasingly becoming gentrified. And since a lot of jazz's audience in the 1950s were white folks who had gotten put onto the West Coast thing, many of them felt alienated from this new stuff. And unsurprisingly, sensing the dire straits ahead, a lot of these new musicians banded together to protect their financial and creative interests. The most well-known of these new collectives was probably the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, or the AACM.
This music is a spirit, ancient and profound. It speaks of all life, journeys, and the oneness of completion with the one.
The pianist Muhal Richard Abrams founded them in 1965, and 4 years later in 1969, it would spawn the equally well-known Art Ensemble of Chicago. A lot of other lesser-known collectives sprung up as well, including the Creative Arts Collective, the Black Artists Group, the Underground Musicians Association, and even a few overseas, if you can believe that. Side note, not a single one of these organizations includes the word jazz, or even the phrase avant-garde, anywhere in their names. Naturally, so many artists suddenly tending towards what you could consider to be atonality, of course drew comparisons with the similar movement that had happened in European classical and art music about 60 years earlier. Comparisons that these new musicians did not like at all, often citing it as another example of a uniquely American compulsion to try and liken every new black thing that pops up to some white forebear that did it first. In this same vein, there was a fair amount of resentment surrounding the comparative success and visibility that white avant-garde artists had achieved. Regarding John Cage, Leo Smith had this to say: "It was supposed to be one of the most innovative things to take place in music, and all they did was add different rhythm instruments and things that he had compiled, supposed to be his sound-making tools. We'd been doing that for years, as a people in this country, not just in Africa." Now, in the 1960s, a driving element behind a lot of the new music being made, as you might imagine, was the extremely caustic socio-political environment. Now, I've already mentioned this, but the revolution against the word jazz itself and its connotations paralleled the revolution that black Americans were going through at the time against racism and Jim Crow. And Archie Shepp drew this parallel himself. His words were this: "If we continue to call our music jazz, we must continue to be called niggers." To some, this was an extreme comparison, but given the connection between the word jazz itself and the ideological roots of the new music movement, not to mention the mounting energy that civil rights activity was generating, it's no wonder that so many musicians dove into the new thing with political, social, and sometimes religious fervor. Now, a couple of the most popular examples of this type of music rooted directly in the civil rights struggle was the Max Roach Freedom Now suite, which was so popular and well-known that it even gained a spot in Ken Burns and Mingus's Fables of Faubus. This was music that was more focused on anger over injustice and the immediacy of the need for freedom. Now, on the more spiritual, esoteric side of that is one musician that pretty much everybody can agree is great, John Coltrane. And after his grand modal experiment with Miles Davis on what is still known as the most seminal jazz record of all time, he would go on to further explore the possibilities of limited modalities with his own quartet. Then he heard free musicians like Ornette Coleman and Sun Ra, who we'll talk about later, and in so doing gained a much clearer perspective on his own creativity. In many ways, A Love Supreme is one of the only unifiers of a genre that was becoming increasingly stratified. It was free and trance-like and hypnotic and harkened back to those most ancient of sounds. It was undeniably rooted in the free school in this way, but there was enough harmonic and modal material for even the staunchest of bop advocates to chew on for several years. And chew they did, because even now, you would be hard-pressed to find a jazz adherent of any subgenre who does not, loudly and often, sing the praises of that record. Of course, when we get to some of Coltrane's truly avant-garde work like Interstellar Space, which was just him and the drummer Rashid Ali, this is the stuff that is less known. And understandably so. But if you're an adventurous listener who's curious about transgressive sounds, as I am, give that record a listen. It's a trip. Even Louis Armstrong, who throughout his career remained true to jazz's classic days, sometimes at the expense of the respect of his peers, he was disillusioned with the condition of America when he came back from overseas. And he found himself in this weird place where he was spurned from white circles for being too political, and he was spurned from black circles for being too much of an Uncle Tom. And it is here, with Armstrong's exclusion from the latest iteration of the music he had had a huge hand in making and popularizing, that we can find exemplified one of the new music's most divisive, least talked about, yet core elements. The idea of blackness itself, what it means to be black in America. Now, like we've talked about, new musicians completely shunned labels and titles for their music because they just considered it to be black music. But even within the boundless realms of the avant-garde, the idea of something or someone not being black enough created obstructions for certain people. Maybe you've heard the phrase, "not all skin folk are kinfolk," the meaning of which is that having black skin does not necessarily make you black. Well then, and this is where I'm going to really ask you all to put your critical thinking caps on. What does it mean to be black? Is that something we can nail down? For the time, it was tied to ideas like a respect for one's history, a willingness to be incendiary and actively pursue change, and almost a duty, a compulsion, to aggressively, sometimes violently, speak truth to power. Entire books have been written trying to fully explain the subject, but being black, much like anything with a denotative label, must come with some kind of qualifications. And in this way, the irony of how popular jazz canon looks back on the music of the 60s is really palpable. Because the music of that entire decade and its relevance, this decade that was so focused on Pan-Africanism and black nationalism and civil rights and all of these ideas, the hearkening back to the depths, the roots of black American music, that decade, it was cherry-picked for this supposed blackness. So why do we only talk about Roach and Mingus and Coltrane and sometimes Ornette and Cecil Taylor, but we leave out people like Sun Ra or Carla Bley? To put it real simply, the answer is because their music was not, at least overtly, contributing to anything political. To many traditionalists, black and white alike, the new music being made in the 60s was only worth it when it was speaking out against something. When it was being used as a violent expression of blackness and the struggle for liberation. Artists who weren't engaging politically were largely forgotten. Coltrane is the notable exception, but like I said, he was the great unifier and everybody loved him already. Now you might hear my assessment and say to yourself, well, it was an intense time. It was important to say what needed to be said, and everything else could get sidelined. And I would be inclined to agree because that's a fair defense if that mindset had changed. And with that being said, let's talk about black pain. Now back when I wrote this originally, the actor Marsai Martin had recently come forward and said that she was going to refuse to take on any roles that had anything to do with the concept of black pain. What is black pain? Well, movies, books, TV shows, comics, video games, really any media where the representation of black characters is entirely focused on the horror and trauma that they have had to endure in the United States. The idea that if you're going to write a black story, it has to be about something awful. It can't be about something that's fun, it must be your trauma. And a lot of black folks have noticed this. RDC World at the time had an entire sketch that they'd done.
It's about a group of friends, black of course, traveling through time. They find a time machine and go on all sorts of adventures, including robots, dinosaurs, aliens,
slaves, right?
Now, it's been about 4 years since I wrote this originally, and in that time, representation outside of trauma has increased. But the backlash to a lot of this representation just serves to drive home this big idea that if you're black, you must always have something angry to say about it. You must always be suffering. You are not allowed to tell stories outside of that. And we can see the manifestation of the centrality of black pain in entertainment, not just today, but in the history that we're talking about right now, with the systematic erasure of less politically active voices in modern jazz education. Now, I'll give you one guess as to who was a big contributor of that, but we're going to talk more about that later. Now, restrictions on the idea of blackness, what you are allowed to be, what you are allowed to talk about when you are black, are damaging on a lot of levels. We've been talking about how it's damaging on the historical level, but for a lot of young black people, myself included, it's been damaging personally too. I and a lot of black kids like me grew up liking things that weren't considered to be especially black. I grew up liking Kingdom Hearts, I liked Zelda, I liked high fantasy, I read The Hobbit cover to cover like 6 times. Which of course makes it very difficult to continue enjoying sci-fi and fantasy when I'm very clearly not wanted in that space, but that's an entirely other discussion. And I wasn't really into sports, and I didn't really listen to hip-hop, although that aspect of me has obviously changed. I dressed and I spoke a certain way, and I know I'm far from the only kid who heard "you act white, you talk white, you're an Oreo." On a daily basis, those statements, and worse, were lobbed at me. There's not really anything you could say to me that hasn't already been said. Even worse, these limitations on expressions of black creativity are often self-imposed. That is, from within the community. Remember when I told you we were going to be thinking critically? For many artists, exclusion from the jazz tradition and exclusion from the black tradition were synonymous along those lines. You don't fit cleanly into our definition? we're not talking about you. And this leads us to somebody that I mentioned earlier who many of you all may not know, Sun Ra. As maybe the prime example of a leading figure in apolitical 60s music, he was an enormous influence on John Coltrane. Upon hearing some of Ra's music in the 50s, as well as reading some of his literature, Coltrane was able to kick his addiction, and very shortly thereafter he marked a new point in his career and his journey into the avant-garde. There is evidence to suggest that Ra was also one of the first to meaningfully experiment with modality, and if these are just the early stages of Ra's influence, why is he ignored so often? The answer should be pretty obvious by now. Ra did not fit the musical or the social mold. Musically, he wasn't writing to decry socio-political conditions in America. He was seeking out what he believed was a higher Afrofuturistic truth. Now, socially, he spurned the Christian church, which was not that uncommon for black people of the time, but then he spurned religion altogether, which is kind of a cardinal sin for black people. But in spite of his willful defiance of the avant-garde's immediate political connotations, his music was no less meaningful and exciting. Ra was also one of the earliest prominent exponents of Afrofuturistic imagery. That is, the marriage of African aesthetics and soundscapes with futuristic or science fiction imagery. And to that end, if you're unfamiliar, I would suggest checking out the record Space is the Place, a record on which Sun Ra sought to portray Afrofuturism in a soundscape environment. Now, it's worth mentioning that Sun Ra's personal philosophy was considered strange by many, and I won't get too much into the weeds of it here, but to summarize, he had an entire complex mythology that involved interspace travelers, Egyptian gods, and a return to outer space. Ra was really well known for elaborate costumes and stage rituals that he would engage in with the orchestra, his personal band, who lived on a commune together. And in this way, his cult of music kind of stood in direct opposition to the ever-present influence of Christianity in the black community, both socially and musically. And most black people found him too weird, not to mention heretical, to support. But again, there's a lot of irony in many black people not considering Ra to be conventionally black enough, when much of his music, vocally, instrumentally, harkened back to the sounds of the motherland. In Ra's music, we can find three vocal techniques that were common to avant-garde music and that were often used to connect the new music back to the roots of black music in general. First are drones. Now, drones are common in indigenous music the world over. Not just African, but Native American, Asian, Australian. The idea of making a piece of music from a single note as a means of compelling the listener into a meditative state is one of the most ancient in all of music. Building on the idea of a meditation or a trance is repetition. This is a significant element that's found not just in traditional music, but also in more contemporary styles. When you listen to a vamp, or even the looped instrumental tracks in hip-hop, these are all forms of trance, repetition. Music, repetition, and the trance are a trinity that appear in many places in black music. So many that I might do a whole other video just on that at some point. And of course, both of these elements also tend to have some spiritual significance, which is why Coltrane, and by extension McCoy Tyner, were noted for using them as much as they did. Next up, a more obvious one, call and response. Call and response is a pivotal part of the traditional music of West Africa. It still is even today. And it's been present in black music in America as long as black music has existed in America. From field songs, field hollers, ring shouts, the gullahs, and then once it carried into jazz music, it basically didn't change form at all. And then finally, shouts and hollers. Now, we think of these wild, screeching, shouting kind of solos as an avant-garde thing, but I mean, if you listen to swing music, the same thing was happening there in many ways, just not as often and not as obvious. And it's funny because Ra's music was dismissed as not being black enough when fundamentally it was blacker than most other stuff going on at the time. And he knew it. And finally, the orchestra itself. You can't talk about Sun Ra without talking about his group. Now, some may bill it as organized chaos, although both of those words, funny enough, are anathema to pretty much everything the new musicians stood for. Ra's commune would practice intensively, like 4 or 5 hours a day, the goal of which was to be tightly locked in and foster communication and connection. Now, remember earlier we were talking about the intent, the preparation, and the sincerity of this music as being essential to the magic of it. For the music to sound genuine, there had to be a much greater level of intent and communication. But to many outside observers, this was unfortunately irrelevant. If communication and interdependence weren't self-evident, why did they matter? Nevertheless, the orchestra was probably the premier example of the new music's philosophy of communication through black music married to spontaneous invention. And note that when you describe it out loud like that, it doesn't sound a whole lot different from the jazz we're used to hearing, does it? So in the discussion of sound versus intent, it's pretty clear that a lot of music being made in the 60s was more about the intent. The sound people didn't really care for. Now next time we're going to look at the 70s, and we're going to find out what happens when the intent of something becomes subordinate to it just sounding good. And from a decade of intent over sound to a decade of sound over intent, come the 80s we can find ourselves with a happy medium, one that's persisted in the genre to the modern day. Tune in next time and we'll talk some more about this stuff.